You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week, and we certainly appreciate you joining us again after our short little 2-week break, as both myself and my partner moved over the last 2 weeks, and we kind of were out of pocket, but we're certainly glad that you guys chose to stay with us, and we are back better than ever, and we'll be with you every single week going forward. I want to remind you guys, check us out on all of our social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Also get on iTunes, leaving us a rating and a review. Certainly helps us grow the show, and we appreciate all the ratings and reviews you guys left while we were on break. This week's episode brought to you by Blue Apron. Blue Apron delivers all the fresh ingredients and recipes you need in exactly the right proportions to make simple, seasonal home-cooked meals. New recipes are created each week by Blue Apron's culinary team, so you can learn to cook with new ingredients, cuisines, and cooking techniques. Meals are just 500 to 800 calories and start at just $8.74 a serving, and shipping is always free. I'm telling you, we've used Blue Apron many times here at the Hazard Ground. Their food is delicious, and every sponsor on the Hazard Ground is a product that we've used personally, and we stand behind 100%. Otherwise, we wouldn't waste time talking about it before the episode. Now, for a limited time, new customers are going to get $30 off their first order. That's right, $30 off your first order at blueapron.com. So go over to our website, hazardground.com/sponsors. Click on the Blue Apron banner. Remember, support for our sponsors goes right back into making Hazard Ground the best show it could possibly be. Once again, that's www.hazardground.com/sponsors. Click on the Blue Apron banner and get the discount and discover a better way to cook. Now on to this week's episode. This week's guest is a retired Air Force colonel. He's also a helicopter pilot. He spent over 25 years in the Air Force and participated in just a variety of missions that, unlike anything we have had here on the Hazard Ground podcast, everything from search and rescue of the Challenger explosion to a prison riot off the coast of North Korea, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. It is Colonel Retired Tommy Goode on the Hazard Ground podcast. Tommy, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be with you.
All right, so look, you have a very interesting resume over the course of 25 plus years in the Air Force, and I want to hear about as much of it as possible, but we always want to know from people how they got their start in the military. Why did you end up in the Air Force?
I grew up in a rural southern Maryland, surrounded by my relatives. My grandfather was there. He was a tobacco farmer. So, and my parents were, we were lower middle class. So my dad was a mechanic. My mom was a nurse's aide. I grew up just, with no guidance on what you should do in your life. And I remember, I was about 12 years old and, trying to figure out, and I remember looking out the window of my grade school because we lived near Patuxent River Naval Air Station, which is a big naval base on the East Coast in Maryland. And all of a sudden this, like a F-14 flies by. I guess we were on the approach end of one of their runways. So F-14 flies by. A few minutes later, a P-3 Orion flies by. 10 minutes later, a helicopter goes by. And I remember it dawned on me. I said, holy shit, these guys get paid to fly aircraft. And so at 12, I said to myself, that seems like the perfect job, to get paid to fly. But I'd never been in an aircraft, so I really didn't know what it was like. So graduated high school, had no inkling of going to college. I don't know why. Went to jobs, carpentry and construction, the standard stuff. And one day I was working a job at the Russian embassy in DC, a union job, making pretty good money. And I looked over, I'm humping 2x4s up a hill. And I look over and there's a 50-year-old man next to me humping 2x4s up the hill. And I said, oh man, I got to do something else. And at that point I was already like 21 years old. So I immediately went down to the local college, figured out how do you go to college. I had no money, and they told me all the steps and apply for grants and loans. And I signed up for Embry-Riddle down in Daytona Beach. Never been away from home a day in my life. Signed up for that. Got the $300 from my dad for the initiation fee. And he said, you're on your own. Went down there and signed up with Air Force ROTC at Embry-Riddle. It was the biggest in the country for a private university. And they had 600 guys. And like everybody at that point, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I said, shit hot, this is the way to go. That was 1980 when I showed up. I graduated 1983. And right before graduation, you have to take your commissioning physical. And I had secured a pilot slot. So I was pretty happy that I had secured a pilot slot. Well, I line up like all of them, and I take my eye test, and I failed the physical with a 20/25 left eye, and you had to have 20/20. And I was freaking devastated at that point. So I said, what do I do? They said, well, you're going to be a navigator. And I said, no. I want to be a pilot. So they said, well, go downtown, pay ophthalmologists to show us you have 20/20, and we'll reconsider you. So I do that. It takes a week. I don't have any money to begin with. Come back, I got 20/20 in both eyes. And the guy goes, well, that's fantastic. The master sergeant who was in charge of admin, except we gave your pilot slot to the next guy that passed his physical. Yeah, right? So I was like devastated again. So I said, what can I do? And I said, well, you can write a letter to the area commandant, see what he says. So I did. I heard back from him like 5 days later. He said, well, sorry to tell you there's no fixed wing slots, but we have rotary wing slots. And if you want one of them, you can have them. And I was so stupid at the time. I'm like, what's rotary wing? He goes, helicopter flight. And I go, oh. And he goes, I go, the Air Force has helicopters? And he goes, oh, yeah, we got like 200 or 300 of them. So immediately I signed up and went off to flight school from there, never having flown anything before in my life. And that's basically how I got in the military.
All right, I got to back up and ask you a couple quick questions. When you were 12 years old and you were seeing those planes flying overhead, did you know what they were at the time? Did you have like a preconceived notion of studying?
Now.
Okay.
I mean, I knew what a fighter was, because they would come by. They were sleek and beautiful.
Right.
And then a cargo plane, which happened to be a P-3, and then a helicopter. I knew what they were, but I really didn't know anything about aviation at that point. And like I said, my parents, they never spoke of college. They never said, you got to be a better life. Now, I had a good life, but it was going to be a blue collar, work your butt off life.
Right.
That's just the way it was in my family. So yeah, I went to the Air Force. Shit, they were paying me in ROTC $150 a month.
That's
so
not
I was
bad.
Pretty happy.
Yeah,
right
especially in 1983. But okay, but you have to tell me, what did you say to the civilian doctor that gave you 20/20? What was the explanation? What was the story if you didn't have any money?
Well, the real story was I had been studying all night because you got to remember, I didn't go to college till I was 22. So I was motivated. I went to class every day. I didn't party, but I studied all night. So my eyes were tired. I'd been up till like 2 a.m. And so when I went to the civilian guy and told him the story, he gave me a discounted rate, but my eyes were fresh when I saw him because he actually said on the phone, cover your eyes and don't work them today and then come over and take the test. When I got 20/20, and what people don't realize is after you pass that initial 20/20, you can basically go blind and they'll fix it for you, but you gotta have 20/20 to get through the door. And that was a huge deal. I don't think I've had 20/20 6 months after that. In fact, they lasered my eyes later, something they wouldn't even have thought of in 1983.
Right.
You couldn't even have contacts on your eyes. They would know because they were hard contacts back then.
Back in the day, yeah exactly. All right, so you commissioned in 83.
Right.
What was that like? How proud of a moment was that for you? And what happens next after you get to your second lieutenant?
Well, it was hugely proud. I was the first person in the entire Goode family that had ever gone to college, let alone graduated. So a lot of them came down to Florida, saw me get pinned on, and it was a fantastic feeling. But I got to say the better feel. I mean, it was good to get that certificate, of your BAS, and mine was aeronautical science. So I shoot off to flight school, which was Fort Rucker, Alabama, because you go to the Army first. And so you run around. The first thing we flew was a little bug smasher. It's called a TH-55. It's like a Volkswagen with rotor blades on the top of it, and gasoline powered, five belts running the rotor. It was very interesting, but great to learn in. I just remember the first day of when you get to the flight line, because I did good on the academics. I had come out of an aeronautical university, but never flown. So I knew all the aeronautical stuff. But the first day they take you out there and they put you in a field about 200 yards by 200 yards. And they try to let you hover this little contraption. And at the end of the first day, or end of 2 hours, you get 2 hours, you're sweating bullets and you haven't even come close to hovering this helicopter. And I just remember walking off the flight line with my stick buddy going, I don't know what I'm going to do now, but I can't do this because I'm no good at it, not knowing that everybody struggles for the first 3 or 4 days to try to figure out. So, you progress from there, and the day that you can hover that helicopter, which is about 3 to 4 hours into the program, all of a sudden you can steady it and you can keep it in a 10 square foot area, and you feel like, $1 million. And then after that, they progress you to the Huey, single engine Huey, and then you go to tactics, then you go to night stuff. And even in 83, they had NVGs, but they were what was called full face NVGs, TVS 5s. So when you put them on, you couldn't look under them. They covered your entire face. And then somebody figured out, you got to cut the bottoms off these. This is what we should do, so we can look under and see the instruments of the aircraft. Because at that time, you would just take one tube and refocus it every 2 or 3 minutes inside the aircraft so you could see what the instruments were doing, because you couldn't see anything except outside. So we did all the tactics, and then what we call about the 8-month period, we get what was called reblued. So you come back into the Air Force side for the last 6 weeks, and they make you fly your butt off in the instruments, and then you graduate. And, at the 10-month point, they pin your wings on you. At that point, you feel like, I have really arrived, even though you're a second lieutenant, never been anywhere, but you're like, I got wings, baby. This is, that was a big deal.
So it's 1984. You get your wings. What's your first assignment?
I get sent down to, I graduated number 1.
Oh, congratulations. There you go.
Yeah. But the number 1 guy normally gets his choice of assignments. So, even in 84, I said, well, I want Blackhawks. And the second thing I said, I want the Jolly Green Giant, which was the bigger aircraft, the Vietnam aircraft. And then you just list where you would like to go. Well, the number 1 guy got his 7th choice. And I went to Patrick Air Force Base for Jolly Green Giants, HH-3Es, and supporting the Space Shuttle rescue mission and all the space stuff. And then, we were also trained to do search and rescue, but not the emphasis on combat at that time, because we were, stateside and civilian.
Where is Patrick Air Force Base? Why is it not ringing a bell with me?
It's about 20 miles south of Cape Canaveral.
Okay, Florida.
Yeah,
okay.
5 miles north of Melbourne on the East Coast.
Wow.
Beautiful place.
That doesn't sound like a bad assignment for a single second lieutenant at the time. Sounds pretty cushy.
I had base housing. My car would get salted every night because of the beach, the sea spray coming in. That's how close to the beach we were.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. It turned out pretty good.
And so how long is that first duty station?
I was there 3.5 years.
And when they tell you that you're doing space shuttle stuff, what are you thinking?
I had no idea what they were doing, but what it turned out to be is you are the rescue for the astronauts. And little did I know they had 7 contingencies for a space shuttle. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they would, if they needed to if they had a problem right on the launch pad and the thing was whatever, the fuels were mixing wrong or something, we had to fly in and land next to it. They would slide down and we'd take them away. That seemed dangerous to me, very dangerous, because it's going to blow up is probably the problem. They also had 4 or 5 more contingencies where if they had a problem way up high, they would return to the Cape and land it. It had a 3-mile runway. That's where they landed it a lot of times. Or if they couldn't make it to the runway, they would put it on the ground somewhere and we would go rescue them. But the one we were most interested in was out at sea. If they were too far away, they would ditch it in the ocean, and it was our job to pick them up and bring them home.
Okay, so you have this assignment, and little do you know, about 1.5 years, almost 2 years later, whatever time frame it was, January 28th, 1986, the Challenger shuttle takes off. I remember this vividly as a kid. They stopped school for us.
Yeah, everybody does.
And Krista McAuliffe was the teacher, who was first teacher who was going into space. It was supposed to be a very historical moment, a teacher going up in space to help, teach kids across America about it. It was a huge, huge deal. And so they stopped school. I remember watching it. I think I might have been in 3rd or 4th grade at the time. And I remember watching it and not really understanding the scope of what happened about a minute into flight of the shuttle. So where are you when this thing takes off, and what are you told that day?
Well, that day I was fairly new aircraft commander, first lieutenant, 2.5 years into the Air Force. So the space shuttle had become very routine. So we always flew as a 2-ship. We always flew with a couple of Rescuemen, which you probably heard the term PJs.
Yep, we've had a couple on the podcast.
Sure, yeah. So they always flew with us, and we had a flight surgeon with us. Our job was go up first, clear the airspace over the water before the launch, and get any boats out of there. And we actually had a loud hailer on the machine, and we would say, "You need to move east, 10 miles or whatever. You're in a danger zone." So once we did that, we would refuel, and we would land about 1.5 miles from the shuttle, which was actually very close. It doesn't sound that close, but we could feel when they took off. I mean, and I'd been on like 15 or 20 of these at that point. When they took off, you could feel the sound waves of the engines hitting your chest. I mean, they would just go pop, 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 off your chest. So we all remarked that morning how freaking cold it was. And, we'd seen the pictures of icicles falling off or hanging on the shuttle. And we thought, because this particular shuttle had been delayed like 6, maybe more times. And so they were itching to get it off. And we thought, they're going to delay this one again. They're going to cancel it. So we're sitting there, and our job was both ships sitting there. We would leave the APU running, and we would stand outside the aircraft and look at the launch. So this particular day, we look at the launch. It looks the same as always. Beautiful, loud. It goes up into the sky, and I can still remember looking straight up in the sky, and people don't realize how high it was when it blew up. It was 100,000 feet.
Oh, wow.
And we were looking at it, and we saw the corkscrews of the solid rocket boosters, the SRBs, spiraling off. But we couldn't tell it had exploded. We looked at each other and we said, "That's not right. Something's wrong here." And so 2 seconds later, we go, "Holy shit," jump in the aircraft. Let's see what's up. start firing up the engines, and we're not even, we don't even have the rotors completely turning yet. And our main contact was the Cape, and he was called Cape Leader. He came over the radio and said, launch the rescue assets immediately. Launch the rescue assets. Never said it had blown up, anything. So a minute later, we pull pitch on our aircraft, and we pointed east out over the ocean, 2 ships, and just start dashing as fast as we could, even though we were like, I don't know, we thought it was going to return to land and probably land in the ocean.
Right.
So we get about 9 or 10 miles out, and at that point the radios are silent, and we had this crusty old PJ in the back. He was like 43 years old. He was at the end of his career. He wouldn't even jump. He wouldn't even do parachute jumps on the land anymore. He would only jump into the water, and which seems young now, but he stuck his head in the cockpit, and we were looking out the front, and we see these little white splashes on the ocean. And first it was 1, then another, then 4 or 5. And it took like 2 seconds for everybody to realize. He says, "Brake left, brake left, brake left." And we realized the space shuttle debris was falling on the ocean, and we were about to drive right into it. So both ships brake left, run as far away as we can, and ask Cape Leader what's going on. And he says, we believe there's an explosion. Of course, at that moment we were pretty sure there was an explosion because the pieces were hitting the ground. But yeah, he didn't save our life, but he recognized it, in time to go, brake left. And so we went north, and we got out of the area, and they made us the on-scene commander, which was like, okay, what exactly does that mean? I know what an on-scene commander is, but what are we supposed to do? And about 2 minutes later, we get what's called a BIM indicator on the main rotor blades on a Jolly Green Giant had nitrogen-filled spars in them. And if there was any holes put in it, the nitrogen would leak out. You'd get a cockpit indication. And so instantly we thought, one of those pieces hit our main rotor blades. As it turns out, but normally we would do a precautionary landing for that, and we were 30 miles away from home. We pointed it towards Patrick, hauled ass home, told him we needed that, what we had, and they said, we have a rotor blade waiting. Land and we'll change it, which is interesting because that job normally took about 6 to 7 hours of 5 guys, and we landed and we're back in the air in 22 minutes and they changed the main rotor blade. And I just thought that was astonishing. So when we get back up there, it was actually 45 minutes before anybody could go into the area because debris was falling on radar the entire time. And once we got back and the debris stopped falling, we went into the area, and we went about another 6-7 miles from where we were, and we saw these big, what I would describe as giant Alka-Seltzer tablets coming up from the ocean. And what it really was the main engines of the shuttle, not the solid rocket boosters, but the main engines had fallen into the water and were still so hot that they were bubbling up from the sea floor. And so the long and short of it was we spent 7 days searching and picking up and marking pieces. And one of the pieces was, it was the main landing gear and a wing. This thing was not tiny pieces like it looked like on TV. It was actually big pieces. And 30 days later, they found the crew compartment of the shuttle astronauts. The Navy did via sonar. And they were still, all of them except one were intact and in the crew compartment.
Wow. So the explosion didn't kill them.
Well, there's all kinds of speculation on that, and but what we do know from our flight surgeon who was on the accident investigation board was two of them had their emergency oxygen on, which in those days it had gotten so routine they didn't wear a whole astronaut pressurized suit anymore. They wore just a helmet that was pressurized, and the fact that two of them had their emergency oxygen turned on was this bizarre thing of, did they know it was going to explode, or did they turn it on after it exploded? So a lot of speculation on that, but I do know that that was what they found.
Wow. I mean, that's just all these years. It was such a
Yeah.
seminal moment in any young kid's life who watched it, because, you know, it was going to space. And you know, to hear that recounted now, all these years later, without knowing that, is just a wow. I mean, that's a wow.
Yeah, it was a wow moment at the time, and then, you know, it just kind of fades off into the distance. But yeah, it was. I mean, we all knew it was history at the moment, because we're like, the space shuttle just exploded and Kristen McAuliffe was on it, and, you know, the whole world was watching because they'd never put a civilian on one of them before, and then of course it turned out very poorly.
Right. So that's 1986. You know,
Right.
9/11 is still 15 years away before you
Right.
ever actually get into a combat scenario. But over the course of the next 15 years, I mean, you did a variety of different things, search and rescues type stuff, including rescuing a French sailor off the coast of Florida who treaded water for 13 hours. I mentioned the prison riot off North Korea, an Iceland rescue, an 11-hour flight in bad conditions. I mean, did all this stuff start to become routine to you?
Oh yeah. It actually is. I mean, you train so much, you know this. You train so much that it becomes routine. But I mean, you do know, like the guy we picked up off the coast. That was an interesting story, because it was another beautiful day, and we get a call at 7:30 in the morning, and they say, hey, can you go out on this? There's a sailboat that says they've heard a man or a person calling out for help. Well, it turns out the sailboat is 25 miles off the coast. And we're like, how can this be? And the Coast Guard said they can't do it. So we said, probably because you think it's a nut job out there, you know, calling it in. So we jump in the aircraft. We were on alert. We fly out there, and I remember the water was so calm, and it was the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it was glass. I had never seen the Atlantic Ocean glass. And we get a couple miles off the coast, and then there's another report. Hey, a man fell overboard during the night from a fishing trawler. That's interesting, you know. 2 minutes later, the report was a second man fell overboard from a fishing trawler. And we're thinking, it's so calm out. How do you fall off a boat? It's not like, or a ship. It's not like bad seas. So, and you got to remember, this is, you know, the late 80s. There's no GPS. So we were, you know, happy to go find the sailboat, more or less, people that had fell overboard. And they said they had fell overboard during the night. So we decided, all right, we're going to fly to the sailboat and set up what we called an alternate sector search. I mean, it's the only thing we do. So we get close enough, we fly high, and we look, wow, there's a sailboat. And we decided we'll take a heading across it and come back towards the west so we can look down sun. And we're all thinking, there's no way this is real. There's no way we're going to be able to find one person in this big ocean. And sure enough, we cross the sailboat. We're at like 500 feet. We go out about a mile, and that's where we're going to turn and come back and cross the sailboat again, because it's like a triangulation thing. I look down between my feet through the chin bubble, and there's a man treading water on the slick ocean, and it was sheer luck. He was right underneath the aircraft. And the funny thing is, I go, what are the odds? So the PJs are in the back again, and say, hey, I got a guy here. Let's come right, pick him up. One PJ jumps off of comm, puts his wetsuit on, and he's going to be the guy to go in. Now, our particular aircraft at that point, the hoist was not working on it. So what a lot of people forget is this helicopter, the Jolly Green, was amphibious. So the procedure is we come around, we throw out the PJ on a low and slow, and then we come back around and pick him up. Well, little does he know, as we're making the right turn, there's two hammerheads circling this guy. And the other PJ, I report, hey, do you see those hammerheads? And he goes, yeah. And I go, do you still want to go in the water? And he goes, he's already off comm. He'll be fine. So he never heard
that is great.
that there's sharks in the water, and they were two big hammerheads. Anyway, we put him out, come back around, pick him up, pick both of them up. The guy gets on board and starts yammering like crazy that there was a mutiny on his boat at 8:00 the previous evening, and that the crew that they had picked up somewhere up north had tried to take over the boat. They had shot the captain and threw him overboard and hit him in the head. He had a big gash on his forehead, hit him in the head with a pipe, and he jumped overboard before they could do anything else. And he reported that he saw the sharks eat the captain. Sharks eat the captain. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So, but what makes this story is so interesting is the circumstances that have to come together. As we found out later, the sailboat was sailing back from the Bahamas, and the wind dies overnight. That's why it was so slick. I mean, there was no wind, not a whisper. And he decides to fire up his engine and continue the trek back to the United States. Well, then his engine fails, and he goes down below deck 25 miles out to fix the engine. His wife is on the deck, and she says, and they're in their 70s. These are 70-year-old people. She says, I can't remember their names. I wish I could. Hey, I hear somebody yelling for help. And of course, his first reaction is, you're going batshit crazy. We're 25 miles out. There's nothing here. And, but being a good husband, she says, no, I heard voices. He calls the Coast Guard. So the chances of that, and then the other chances that this guy, when we picked him up, had his underwear on only. He said he went over with his pants on, and he tried them as a flotation device. But he lost his pants trying to, blow him up. Right. Sharks were bumping against this guy all night long. He had went in the water at 8:00 the previous evening, and we picked him up at almost 9:00 the next day. And you got to think some kind of divine intervention here, and the fact that we flew directly over him, which, I couldn't believe. And the odds of that are quite small. And then our hoist was, capable of landing in the water so we could pick the guy up. It turned out to be a great story, and we all had to go to federal court because this was considered the first mutiny at sea in like 50 years of the United States. And the three dudes that did the crime all went to jail. They're probably still in jail. Well, wow. I hope they're still in jail. Yeah, for murder.
That is incredible.
I know. I mean, that guy should have been dead. Just everything that came together, he just should have been dead. There was no way for him to survive that. It just unique circumstances saved his life.
I mean, when you look back on it, are you ever surprised at how the events transpire for certain things to happen to save someone's life?
That one I was kind of mesmerized by, but most of the calls we got, even in combat zones, or, I flew in Beirut and other places prior to 9/11, and you kind of know, our job really was to pick up air crew members. That's the job of combat search and rescue. in the military. But since all these wars really don't have aircrew members being shot down, now we've become anybody behind enemy lines who has, a big problem. So I take my hat off to everybody that's in that service because, we never went out to kill people. There is, most of the military goes out to kill people. We went out to save people. Now, we had miniguns and 50 cals on our aircraft for defensive purposes, and we would shoot anybody that shot at us or anybody we saw was a bad guy. But our job was not to kill people; it was to save people. And so, my hat's off to the guys that still do that because, everybody's deployed their butts off. Most people don't know, since Desert Storm, not 9/11, but Desert Storm, the Air Force Combat Search and Rescue has been at all these no-fly zones, Northern Watch, Southern Watch, Afghanistan. And I mean, they're in Syria right now. They're in Iraq right now. They're in Afghanistan right now. Wherever there's a coalition or U.S. aircraft flying, they're being tasked to go there.
Did you miss Desert Storm? Were you not part of that?
Yeah, I was in Korea at the time. And we volunteered, and we were told in no circumstances
really
that you couldn't go. Yeah. Well, most people don't realize you go to Korea. And I went to Korea in 89, 90. Korea is on a war footing more than any place I had ever been. And even in war zones, I mean, everything was war there. Ready, 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 go. I mean, they were still getting shelled. When you came back from the LOC, the IHawks on our side, you'd look down from your helicopter. Oh, it flew at 500 feet. The IHawks were tracking you on the way in. And if you didn't have the right code in, South Koreans were going to shoot you down. I mean, that's how serious they were over there. So you didn't screw around in Korea. It was, well, I shouldn't say that. We partied hardy, but when you worked, you didn't screw around.
Well, then let's fast forward to combat for you that was legitimate combat for everybody else, and that's Iraq. 9/11 happens. Tell me where you are and what you're thinking and what's happening that day, and what rank are you at this point in time?
At that point, I think I don't know if I'm a light colonel or not yet. I was close if I hadn't pinned it on. I think I was about to pin it on or something. But I was at a classified. I did a lot of Black World stuff, but I was at home at the time, and like you, or maybe not like you, but everybody, I happened to be up at 5:30 in the morning watching TV, and I just remember seeing what everybody else saw, and we had to jump on aircraft and go to work.
What part of the world are you in the United States, though?
Yeah, in the United States. And I will tell you this. I will. There's a lot of things I can't talk about because of but I can tell you this. Within 10 days, or maybe less than that, we're in a remote facility, and we got 2 Blackhawks there, and everybody's ginning up for a certain event. And I walk into the room, and there's got to be 55 or 60 guys in there, and they don't look like anything you've ever seen in your life. I mean, we're talking beards, old, young, everything in between. And I would say 75% of them spoke Arabic, and they want to get trained up really fast on several things. And I just thought, I remember at that moment, because I'd worked with a lot of people, I did not know that we had that kind of capabilities, waiting to jump. And I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's, they've shined a light on the special operations community now that's never been there before, and anybody who's ever been part of it will tell you that they hate it. They prefer to operate under, the cloak of secrecy and darkness because it's easier to do what they do. But what they do to the main public is so sexy, and it's such a thrill to watch from the outside that it's an amazing story to tell. And so, is a double-edged sword there, as you can understand. I mean, we've had people.
Well, there's a lot of guys pretty mad not mad, but they're not happy with the SEAL community and how much, because there's still a ton of silent warriors out there, quiet guys doing their job.
That is correct. And even in the Army as well, in the special ops community, there are guys all over the world who are inserted in places that nobody would ever want to be, basically fighting their own individual war to keep America safe. And for that, it's a thankless, endless job. And I'm thankful I put my head on the pillow at night knowing that there are people out there doing that, because if there weren't, we'd be in a much different place. So from that standpoint, when do you actually get to Iraq, and what is your job when you get there?
Well, I get there in May 2006, and lucky for me, it was right after the Golden Mosque bombing, I
was there for that.
Were you?
I was in Iraq. I was in Iraq through April of 2006, so I remember, yeah.
So everything, the Sunni and Shia, I mean, it broke loose. Yep. They were just killing each other as fast as possible. I mean, they would even set up checkpoints, makeshift checkpoints, where they would, in neighborhoods where the coalition forces weren't, and they would ask you when you drove your car up, are you Sunni or Shia? You had a 50-50 shot. You gave the wrong answer, they killed you, But I got there in May. I was a brand new colonel. I didn't have maybe a week of having my Eagles on, and they made me the director of what was a fairly new operation, the Joint Personnel Recovery Center, which was the job was to go out and rescue and recover MIAs. We didn't have many MIAs at that point. Anybody that's kidnapped or hostage, and POWs. And coming from a combat rescue background, it was a steep learning curve. And I can remember being kind of mesmerized, because the other thing is I had worked in the black world quite a bit. But what was at my fingertips, and didn't realize it till about 4 or 5 days later, was our cell was an ops and intel cell. And we had assigned to us CIA, FBI, Department of State, DEA, NSA, DI, I mean, all the acronyms, plus the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 guys.
Wow.
And the way it worked was, we had to find the target, figure out, where they were, everything about it. And then I would go over to the tier 1 commander and tell him this is this or whatnot. And he had the first right of refusal. So he would say, yeah, not interested, or, we're saddling up in 6 hours, once we get what we think is enough intel on this. So it was a really cool job. And I figured out early on, and what I want people to know is when you go missing, and we had soldiers go missing while I was there, get captured, our main operational guy for the whole year I was there was Sergeant Matt Maupin.
Yep.
And
very familiar.
He had went missing in 2004.
He was at E3 or E4 at the time when he went missing.
Driving a fuel truck and got hijacked by everybody.
He was put on TV. They made videos with him while he was alive.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, and he was our number one priority. Now, when the Haditha thing came up and soldiers got rolled up, I mean, everybody jumped to that instantly. I mean, 8,000 guys, but Matt Maupin was and we never got him back. And, not never, we didn't get him back in the year I was there, but they recovered his body, I think, in 2009.
I was going to say, it was 5 or 6 years later they recovered part of his body.
Right.
They had bones or skeletal remains, whatever it was. And anybody who was in Iraq knows the name Matt Maupin. I mean, he was missing forever. He was right by Abu Ghraib, where Abu Ghraib was where he was ambushed.
Right.
And, he was taken prisoner. Everybody else was killed on sight. He was taken prisoner, and it was just his picture and name were posted in chow halls all over Iraq, and they were looking for him constantly. Again, it was 04, so it was 05 when I got there.
Right.
It was still fresh in everybody's mind, but it's a name that...
And you can't imagine the effort. I mean, we had sources everywhere, and we worked with the CIA, and you can't imagine, and that's what I would like people to know is, even if you're just, our priority was U.S. forces, then coalition forces, then American citizens, and then anybody designated. And you can't imagine the effort that goes into, they're never forgotten. You know what I mean? He was just constantly, every day we would brief and try to run down leads. In fact, when I got there, we had 13 people on the list, if you will call it, and we ran, I want to say, about 60 to 70 break down the door missions. We probably, our success rate was not very good, maybe 10 to 15%. And when I left, we had 31. So on one hand, it was a frustrating job, but it was a noble job that I really enjoyed. And being an Air Force guy on the ground with an M4 in your hand and a Humvee is, something that I will never forget, because I remember the first week going, what am I doing here doing this? I'm a pilot.
Right.
And I had a Marine major, infantry guy who 6'5", he probably kept me from getting killed 5 or 6 times. He would just grab me and go, Colonel, get over here, line of sight. He kept saying, line of sight, get over there. So I appreciated his efforts. But we ended up, I don't know. You ever hear the name Major General Bargewell?
Vaguely.
He was my boss when I showed up.
Okay.
And he was a 2-star. And he was an old Mac V SOG guy from Vietnam. I mean, he had started the original JPRC back in Vietnam. And, he was a no-nonsense guy. Well, he was a Delta Force commander for a while. He had everything on his resume that you could think of. But I remember when I got there, I sat down with him. He had been there, I want to say 17 months. And he just looked tired. I mean, he was just wore out. And he said, this job should be about 10 months long. He said, you're going to come in here full of piss and vinegar, and I know you're going to try your heart out. But at about the 9 or 10 month point, you're going to be out of ideas and you're going to be frustrated. And I never forgot that because he was right. At 10 months, I was just out of ideas and out of, the successes were very few. And then it wasn't because of the effort. That was because Al-Qaeda had figured out how good we were, and they would move these hostages every 6 to 8 hours, and the dry holes, you could tell they were there, but, they were gone when we got there. I don't know.
That's unreal. When you say it, I pause and I reflect on it, and I remember we talk about it all the time on the podcast, just that constant chess match back and forth with the enemy as we improved our tactics and procedures to thwart what they did. Well, then they would change back up on us, and we would change back up on them, and round we go. And it was forever this kind of chase your tail kind of action, and no real gains were made. And that was part of the frustration, because it was just a static position for the most part in the big picture. Right.
Well, I will tell you this: while I was there, 4 Russians got rolled up outside their embassy, and they, within, I want to say 6 hours, they had 2 FSB, Federal KGB guys show up, and they had got all the clearances through the top brass, and they wanted a debrief from my directorship. And these guys were, I've never seen, and I'm not a big fan of Russians, but they were so serious. They never cracked a smile in 1.5 hours of talking back and forth. And they brought in, interestingly, their own guys. And, the U.S. did not want them to bring much of a force in because it was going to be a conflict between who's doing what, because they were considered somewhat neutral. And they laid waste to a lot of people in a short amount of time, just because they didn't have the rules of engagement that the U.S. did.
Yeah, we play much different games sometimes to our own detriment.
Right.
So, of all the things that you have done, and we've detailed some of them here, does any one particular thing stand out as tougher than another, or the toughest mission that you've ever faced? Is it unfair to compare them?
Yeah. And I will tell you this. I've been on, when you're out with several helicopters, it's nighttime. There's no moon. You're low 50. We flew 50 to 100 feet off the earth. The MBGs are crackling. And there was times where you would just be like, 15 times in my career where you would get back from a mission and you would say, how did we not die?
Yeah.
That was the thing where you go, we were so close to either crashing or getting killed by somebody on the ground. And you just go back and you go, how did we not die? But the interesting part is I'm still flying today. And not that kind of flying, but I missed it when I got out of the game big time. But then I compartmentalized it all and don't think much about it anymore. Probably, like everybody else.
Is there a mission that sticks with you that didn't go well, or something that you felt like you could have done more on?
Well, there's a few missions in Iraq where we thought the intel was as tight as you could get it. And we had the right teams in the right place at the right time. And I don't know for sure. What bugs me is I'm assuming on my orders, a few of our operators may have lost their life. I'm not positive which way it would have went, but it just bugged me when I would put, and it happened a lot in Iraq, when I would put our guys at risk and it would turn out to be a dry hole, and you knew the guy was there 3 hours ago, that kind of thing, and then you would just regroup and try again.
How did you know it was time to hang it up?
They sent me to a desk job. I had no idea that, and it's all services. That's not the Air Force, but I had no idea when you became an 06 how political it got. And I had no idea there was this old boys network that if you weren't in it or out of it, because I was not a yes man. I was never a yes man, but I saw how a lot of yes men were moving up the ranks. And it was really disturbing to me that these guys weren't thinking out of the box. They were just filling squares and going as steady as she goes, and I'll get my next rank. And so I pushed back all the time, and I got in a fair amount of trouble for pushing back. But at one point, the two guys that I knew that were above me, they didn't give me a command coming out of Iraq. They sent me to a desk job. I worked for a great special ops general, don't get me wrong. But I just didn't want to be that guy. I wanted to be in command. So I walked in and said, as soon as my 3 years at this rank is up, I'm hanging it up. And he tried to talk me out of it. But he knew I was serious. I'm like, I'm going to go do something else. So I knew at that point I'd gone, because I never expected to go past major in 20 years. That was my goal. And but I knew at that point I was screwed. I was hosed. I was not one of the in crowd.
Yeah, there is just some of that, unfortunately. It's the nature of a rank structured organization. That the higher you go up, the fewer people there are of similar ranks. So from that standpoint, the group gets tighter. When you look back, and you just mentioned how you got sent to a desk job, but you still wanted to fly because you missed it. And can you describe what it is about flying that is so addictive that throughout the 25 years of your career before they sat you down, whatever, 22 years of your career, you never got out of the pilot seat?
Well, I can tell you what I loved every day that I got to go fly. And I'm not a fixed wing guy. I flew a little bit of fixed wing and I didn't like it. What I loved was you could go out there to this machine that is, in all likelihood, is not supposed to fly, just because it's made. There's 10,000 parts moving around in a circle. You pull that left lever up, and you can pick your body and everybody else that's in there off the ground, and you look down and you're not moving, and you go, wow, I am flying and I'm right above the ground. And then to me, the helicopter flying is the last real flying. I mean, you're right on the ground. It's like barnstorming back in the early 1900s. And I never lost that addiction. And I mean, I just got back from flying fighting fires up in Minnesota, and it's all low level, and it's just an adrenaline rush, basically. I guess that's what it is.
Ever crash?
No.
Really?
Never crashed. No,
I was so expecting you to say yes.
No, tore up a few things. I put blades in trees and had a couple of fires, and I had a couple of moments. Almost hit wires several times. I mean, real close where you can see the strands of the wires. I can remember almost hitting wires in country, and my left leg started shaking so bad. That's how close we were, that I couldn't stop it. It was jumping off the floor of the aircraft. And I said, oh my God, we almost just died, and we yanked it up and went over them. But I've never seen it where you can see the strands of them wrapped around a wire. I mean, that's way too close.
How do you sum up your military career?
I would sum it up that I did a lot of good for a lot of people, and we did a great job. I mean, the efforts of not just our group, but I'm partial to combat search and rescue, is guys are willing to put their lives on the line to pick up other guys that are out there hurting or shot or whatever. I mean, it's a great feeling, and that's what I was living for the whole time I was there, is to go. And I think overall I got about 40 to 50 saves out of my career. So I'm pretty proud of that.
No, I mean, it's incredible. Do you remember like all the names and all the situations, or if some of them become blank?
I remember all the situations. Well, most of them, but I don't remember a lot of the names. I can remember, and this was a non-combat thing, but I picked up a F-4 pilot in Korea, and he was up against a tree. His back was all screwed up, and he came in. We pulled him into the aircraft, and we had these patches that were name tag patches, and we made them up to be, my fun meter is pegged. And whenever we picked up a guy who was military or had patches, we would always say, you got to trade us your patch for ours. And so we'd rip his name off his flight suit or whatever and put the fun meter is pegged patch on him, which I thought was pretty funny. And of course, you never had to buy beer most of the time.
Right.
If the guys are around. Yeah.
Has combat search and rescue changed dramatically since you were in it? And is it for the better, or is it just the changes that need to happen given the operational environment?
I think 70% of the changes need to happen because of the operational environment, but they have made it way too complicated. Even when I left, we were doing all these maneuvers and all these gunship protection maneuvers, which I thought was exposing people a lot more than they needed to. And the equipment was just getting overwhelming. The Air Force would take a perfectly great flying machine like the Black Hawk and add so much equipment to it that it was a pig by the time you took off to go for a combat mission. I mean, they're 22,000 pounds, and that's what you took off with. So from that sense, they overdid it, and they're overextending these guys. These guys are gone all the time now. I mean, they're just rotating in and out. And I think they've made it a little bit too complex because, I grew up listening to the Vietnam guys and then moving into the 9/11 era. And the first thing that happens when somebody shoots at you, the two aircraft, because you always fly formation, the guy goes, you go over there and I'll go over here. And, that's what ends up happening versus, well, I'm going to do this hijink maneuver and I'm going to protect you from your rear. It's all fighter pilot crap. But I'd say they're moving in the right direction, and they screwed up, never got a new aircraft. They're still trying to do that and replace their aircraft. But yeah, I feel like I wouldn't be able to do it now 8 years later because it's just too complex.
I feel like I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Anything you'd change about your military career?
No, I don't think so. I might be more nicer to a few people that I didn't know had my career in their hands, not nicer, less abrupt. That would be, because I just didn't hold back. I just didn't, I wasn't a political correct guy.
More diplomatic is the phrase you're looking for.
Yeah, more diplomatic. Very good. See, there you go.
Well, as a lieutenant colonel myself, I've learned as I've gone up the ranks that diplomacy is your best friend. As you talked about that good old boy network, and similar to you, I don't consider myself part of it, but diplomacy and tact are useful tools when it comes to the good old boy network.
Except there's a lot of great ideas that are not getting implemented because people are risk averse today.
Oh,
they're
absolutely.
Way more.
Yeah.
Not in the special ops community so much. That's still okay. But other communities, they're risk averse. And we know from 100 years of doing this in the modern era that you got to take risk to get, better and figure out things.
Well, I mean, look, everything we've discussed, and we barely scratched the surface. I know that, but between the Challenger, and Joint Personnel Recovery Center in Iraq and everything else in between, the guy treading water for 13 hours. I mean, it's just,
right.
You probably have hours more worth of stories to tell us. And unfortunately, I'd, love to sit here and listen to them all. But I mean, it is just an incredible career that you've put together. One you should certainly be extremely proud of. You've made yourself proud. You made your family proud. And that includes your children going forward. And I just, I mean, to hear all this stuff and to think about there are jobs out there and people like you doing jobs that no one really ever focuses on, right? Because they don't write a news story on you picking up a guy who's been stuck in the Atlantic Ocean for 13 hours. It just, that doesn't make headlines anymore. So the fact that there are people like you out there doing it certainly is a reassuring fact to all of us.
Well, and I was even hesitant about doing this. My son talked me into it, but it's just, you do your job and you go home. You hopefully go home. But,
right.
Yeah.
Well, hey,
I appreciate what you're doing, though.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
I think it's great.
Well, 26 years, you got to go home, and you did it with a smile on your face. And so we certainly thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground podcast, for all your service and sacrifice. And what else can we say? Colonel Tommy Goode, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
One quick addendum to this week's show. Tom Goode wanted us to give a shout out to his two kids that are in the Air Force. He meant to do it himself, but got caught up in the questions throughout the course of the podcast and wanted us to just recognize his sons, James and Ryan, who are both currently serving in the Air Force. So we thank them for their service and their sacrifice, and the entire Goode family for all they've done for our country. So again, James, Ryan, and Tom, thank you guys so much for what you do. Want to remind you guys, we're back and better than ever every single week at the Hazard Ground. We'll continue with new episodes next week. Want to remind you guys to keep leaving those ratings and reviews. We certainly appreciated them while we were gone. Means a lot to us, but we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.